Last time I talked about six types of readings, six types of reading, and there were some comments with other suggestions about other types of reading. So I thought I'd follow up on some of these and add to my typology a little bit. Here's another one which was mentioned in a comment on the last post, and that is cheap reading. Cheap reading is where you find an old book for $1 or 50 cents, and it's purely because it's so cheap, purely because it means so little. You feel drawn to it. It's like finding an orphan. I had a great weakness as a child for lost kittens, for example. If there was an abandoned orphaned kitten in the bush, I couldn't help myself. I had to take it in, and my parents had to raise it. I think finding a cheap book is a bit like that, a bit like finding an orphan, taking it in, and precisely because it's worth so little, precisely because it's worth nothing to anybody else, you not only end up buying it, but you end up wasting time reading it as well. I do this a lot. In fact, there are probably many cases where someone who's turned out to become one of my favorite authors is someone I encountered purely by chance because I happened to find one of their old books for $1 in the moldy old bin outside a bookshop somewhere. Here's one I picked up just recently, an old edition of Johnson's Lives of the Poets. There's no date in this, but it looks like it's from about the 1880s or 1890s. A nice little decrepit edition of what was originally Dr. Johnson's 4-volume work with Lives of the English Poets. I've reread a couple of these. There's a wonderful chapter on Shakespeare, a wonderful Life of Milton. I've read the Life of Milton before, but it's kind of different when you read it in an old orphaned book, and I just read that one again today, as a matter of fact. It's both a criticism of Milton's work. He refers to Lycidas, for example, one of the most beautiful poems ever written, as a disgusting, trivial, vulgar poem, and so it's full of Dr. Johnson's own bombastic opinions. And one of the details I really like in his Life of Milton is he discusses Milton's theory that the English weather is too cold for someone to write a great poem. If only he lived in the tropics, he thought, then he could really do some stuff. But as it stands with the cold English winters, he believed he was only capable of writing for about half of the year. During the cold months, his muse would, catch a chill and wouldn't bring him any poetry. Dr. Johnson discusses this at inordinate length, actually, in this biography. And I beg your pardon, the 120-year-old dust on this is about to make me sneeze. Dr. Johnson discusses this theory about the weather. Personally, I grew up in the tropics, and I think Milton would have found that we have the opposite problem in the tropics. How many writers did I ever meet in my entire childhood in the tropics? None, because it's so hot that all you can do is be lazy and go to the beach or lie in a hammock or sit around reading other people's books. But you certainly don't write any books if you live in the tropics. So there might be something to be said for that cold English weather. But anyway, there's a cheap book. Another thing that's nice about finding old books, by the way, I was delighted to see, I'm going to see if I can show you this. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but this is actually filled with, like I say, this would be around about 130, maybe 140 years old, and it's filled with little bookmarks. I hope you can see that. Little pressed flowers that, by the look of it, the way they've interacted with the paper, I'd say the little pressed leaves and flowers would be well over 100 years themselves, and probably would have gone into the grave without anyone ever knowing they were there if I had not seen this orphaned book and taken it into my loving care. So it's full of these lovely pressed flowers and leaves, which someone late in the 19th century made as bookmarks. There's another one all the way through it. So, oh, there's a really nice one. So it goes to show that next time you see a filthy old book in the $1 bin, pick it up. You might just like it. Another type of reading that I neglected to mention last time is what we might call patriotic reading. It's hard for someone living in the United States or living in Great Britain to grasp this. I think it's hard for an American, for example, to be genuinely patriotic, because from North America it feels as though the entire world is simply an extension of North America. If you live, however, on a small, provincial, unknown island, sort of halfway between New Zealand and Indonesia, I'm speaking of Australia, if you live in a provincial place like that, then you feel a sort of healthy, wholesome patriotism when you see a book by one of your countrymen and you take it home and read it. Here's an example of patriotic reading: Anne Hunt's recent book on the Trinity in the thought of the mystics. It's a lovely book, 8 chapters on the Carmelites, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard, and others. And it discusses the kind of theological structure to their mystical writings, their mystical representations of the Trinity. She talks, in conclusion, she talks about the way in which the theological distinction between the immanent and economic Trinity, for example, pretty much disappears in the experience of the mystics. You get a rather more integrated way of thinking about the Trinity as something that is self-involving and so on. It's a very nice book on the Trinity insights from the mystics. That's one example of patriotic reading. Here's another one that I really appreciated. Full confession, I read this. This is The Incarnation of the Word by Edward Morgan, who I believe is a military chaplain now in Australia, and this was based on a PhD thesis that he did in the UK, Cambridge or somewhere like that. And it's on St. Augustine's theology of language. I actually read this one last year, but I've been looking over it again just recently, and it sort of traces the theology of the language through Confessions, De Doctrina, and the De Trinitate. The book centers on the idea that there are some passages where Augustine compares the way in which a thought becomes articulated in speech, the way you verbalize a thought, and that's or you translate a thought into speech, and that's similar to the way in which God is translated into the world of human flesh in the Incarnation. So there's an analogy between speaking, the human act of speaking, and the incarnation of the Word. And Morgan builds a whole argument around this, that for Augustine, it is not that there is any kind of analogy embedded within humanity that makes the connection between humanity and divinity, but rather that the very act of speech, the phenomenon of speaking, is a kind of point of connection between the human and the divine. It's a really impressive book, and a very serious, robust sort of argument for Augustine's theology of language. Finally, there is the category called recommended reading, when a friend or someone you know recommends a book to you. This is the one I most wanted to speak about, and I've already almost used up my YouTube 10 minutes, so I think I'm going to do a separate video just on this remarkable book, Khaled Abou El Fadl's Search for Beauty in Islam. I'll do that one separately, but this was recommended to me by my good friend Scott Stevens, who told me about this book, and I immediately went away and read it, and it is a most extraordinary book. More on that to come.